Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today, Dr. Thomas Schwartz of Vanderbilt University, history professor. We're talking about his new book he's out about, a biography of Dr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. Dr. Schwartz, you've received several positive reviews of your book. Are you pleased with the critical reaction? And have you heard from Dr. Kissinger about what he thinks about your book?
I'm generally pleased that it has had time to be reviewed outside early pre-publication notices. I'm generally pleased with what people are saying, and I'm pleased now that I got a review in the Washington Post today, which is for an academic is an unusual privilege to get into a mainstream media outlet like that. I have not heard anything from Dr. Kissinger. I don't expect to, although I have sent him a copy of the book, and I do think I have tried in a way to be more balanced than the normal. Most of the works on Dr. Kissinger are actually of more recent vintage, are fairly critical, and I think I have tried to reach some sort of balance in assessing his career.
One element of your research, and you mentioned it earlier, that is the network news stories that came from the Vanderbilt Television News archives. How did you use it in the book, and do you find this kind of a research tool to be unique and one that perhaps gives you a better insight to firsthand historical immediacy as compared, say, to personal papers or remembrances?
Well, I got, in a way, I've been very interested in the Vanderbilt News Archive since I arrived at Vanderbilt. I've used it in courses to talk about things like how the Vietnam War was seen by Americans. We have to remember the media environment when the Vanderbilt News Archive began in 1968 was just the three networks. It was a time when most Americans got their news on television, and it was seen as a much more objective way of seeing the news, and this was really important, and I think it did shape how Americans at least perceived their government. What was striking was that on the tapes, the Nixon tapes, is how often they referred to television coverage. Richard Nixon actually calls up Henry Kissinger after his famous Pieces at Hand news conference before the 1972 election to compliment him on being in all three networks and basically wiping McGovern out, as they both say, in the 1972 election. They felt that this was the crowning achievement. They would be able to have a landslide. So politics, the fact that they referred to the network coverage, that Richard Nixon was obsessed with television coverage in a way, and he had his career derailed by the television debates of 1960. So he paid a lot of attention to how television covered his administration.
In terms of Dr. Kissinger's personal life, as you mentioned, he came to this country as a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany. When he got to New York City, he decided to go to City College of New York to study to be an accountant. Did you find it kind of hard to believe that what turned out to be the most influential diplomat in modern American history turned out to be wanted to be a green-eye bean counter, green shade bean counter?
It is one of the wonderful ironies of the Kissinger story. I do think the lesson there, and I know it might be a bit much to grasp for these types of lessons, is just how fundamentally World War II transformed an entire generation of Americans. The opportunities that World War II, I mean, obviously terrible and devastating, and it ended the lives of many, but it also opened up new vistas for thousands and thousands of Americans who went overseas, who fought, who experienced the war. And Kissinger, in going back to Germany, the country that had expelled him, and then being in the occupation, this was an incredible moment psychologically, and I think in all manner, in changing his perspectives on his life.
He particularly risked his life. He was in the Army. He was in the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, he could have been in a quite risky situation had he been captured. Being fluent in German, even though he was just a private, right after the war, he ran a small town in Germany. How did he do, and what impact did that have on his career?
Well, I think the fact that he had such authority at such a young age, when he's in Germany in 1945, he's only 22 years old, 23 years old. I mean, this is a man then had authority over the city of Bensheim, Krefeld, and was involved in rounding up suspected Nazis and members of the Gestapo. The reversal of fortune from being an expelled German Jew to being the American commandant of an occupied city. But in this, I do think one of the positive elements of Kissinger's career, one of the things that should be said, is how generously he occupied or dealt with Germans. He insisted they call him Mr. Henry in order to avoid using his surname, which might have conjured up the idea of where to many Germans might have seemed immediately Jewish, in a way of trying to indicate that he was not there for revenge. He was there to build a new democracy.
When he came back to this country, he was encouraged to go to Harvard. He gained several degrees there, became prominent on the faculty. What drew him to study and then teach international affairs?
Well, I think the war years were critical in that. His experience there, he was actually, as a member of the Army, was giving lessons to senior Army commanders about German history, about what had constituted the basis of Nazi power when he was still in the Army. And I think he came back with very much the sense that he wanted to contribute to creating the basis of peace and stability. And I think he was drawn toward international affairs by a number of mentors who saw a very impressive talent in him at that time.
When Dr. Kissinger first got involved in national politics, he was an advisor not to Richard Nixon, but to former New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was also a presidential rival. How did Nixon and Kissinger get together? How did he go from Nelson Rockefeller to Richard Nixon?
Well, that's an interesting story, because many have doubted, because Kissinger said many negative things about Richard Nixon when he was on the Rockefeller campaign. But Nixon admired him. Nixon read his first book. They had not met until a brief cocktail party in 1967 before the election. And then after the election, Nixon called him up and summoned him down to the Hotel Pierre. Kissinger had made it clear to the Nixon campaign that he was interested. He had provided them some information on the peace talks in Paris. This is a controversial aspect of his career as well. But he had indicated his interest, and Nixon and Kissinger hit it off when they met.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz is our guest from Vanderbilt University. He's a history professor there. He's also written a major new book on Henry Kissinger. Back to continue our conversation after these messages.